I'm Jasmine Li. I'm 34. I emptied my savings to cover my parents' surgery. 2 months later, they told my aunt I was too unstable to trust with family decisions. I sat in that lawyer's office, staring at papers that stripped away everything I'd fought for. My name, crossed out. My brother's name, written in. Power of attorney, medical decisions, financial control. Everything I'd earned through sleepless nights and drained bank accounts, gone. The lawyer cleared his throat. Your parents felt this was the most practical arrangement. Practical. That's what they called it when they erased me. Let me take you back to how it all started. I was always the emotional one. That's what they called it when I cried at family dinners. When I asked too many questions. When I stayed up worried about things that mattered. My brother David was the responsible one. Steady, reliable, the kind of man who answered phone calls with "What's the damage?" instead of "Are you okay?" Growing up, I was the one who remembered birthdays, who noticed when mom seemed tired, who asked dad about his back pain. David was the one who got praised for his job, his house, his ability to keep his feelings contained. When I was 12, I found mom crying in the laundry room. Her hands were shaking as she folded my school uniform. I asked what was wrong. She pulled me close and said, "You're such a sensitive girl, Jasmine. Sometimes I forget you're still just a child." I didn't understand then. I thought it was a compliment. When I was 16, Dad had his first heart episode. Just a scare, they said. But I saw how his face went gray, how his hands clutched his chest. I couldn't sleep for weeks. I'd sneak into their room at night just to make sure he was still breathing. David was away at college. He came home that weekend, patted Dad's shoulder, and said, "Glad you're feeling better, old man." Then he left. Back to his life. Back to his responsibilities. I stayed. I always stayed. In college, I studied healthcare administration. Not because I loved spreadsheets or policy, because I loved the idea of fixing systems that failed people. I wanted to understand why hospitals felt so cold, why insurance companies said no, why families like mine had to choose between rent and prescriptions. David studied business. He got a job at a consulting firm, bought a condo, married a woman who wore pearls to family dinners. They had 2 kids who called me Aunt Jazzy and forgot my name between visits. Mom would brag about David's promotions. Dad would show neighbors pictures of David's house. When people asked about me, they'd say, "Oh, Jasmine's still figuring things out." I was 28 when I figured it out. I got a position at a mid-sized hospital network, managing patient advocacy programs. I helped families navigate insurance denials, find financial assistance, understand their options when the system failed them. I was good at it. I was good at sitting with people in their worst moments, good at translating medical jargon into human language, good at finding solutions when everyone else said there weren't any, but I was still the emotional one. When I brought home stories from work, the single mother who couldn't afford her son's asthma medication, the elderly man whose insurance wouldn't cover his wife's cancer treatment, Mom would pat my hand and say, "You take everything so personally, honey." When I cried during family movies, Dad would shake his head and mutter, "Here we go again." David would just not notice. He'd check his phone, talk about his latest project, redirect conversations back to safe topics. Sports, weather, his kids' soccer games. I learned to be smaller, quieter. I learned to feel things privately, to solve problems without asking for help, to need less from them so they'd have more room for whatever it was they needed room for. I thought I was protecting them from my intensity. I thought I was making it easier to love me. Then Dad got sick. Really sick. It was a Tuesday in March. I was at work when Mom called. Her voice was different, thin, stretched, like it might break if she spoke too loud. "It's his heart," she said. "They want to do surgery." I left work immediately. I drove to the hospital with my hands shaking, my mind racing through everything I knew about cardiac procedures, insurance authorizations, post-operative care. David was in a meeting. He couldn't come until Thursday. I spent that night in the hospital waiting room, filling out forms, talking to doctors, calling insurance companies. I held Mom's hand while she cried. I explained the procedure to her 3 times because she kept forgetting the details. When the surgeon came out after 8 hours, I was the one who stood up to hear the news. The surgery went well, he said, but recovery will be extensive. 3 weeks in the hospital, 2 months of cardiac rehabilitation, physical therapy, medications, follow-up appointments, a complete lifestyle overhaul. David came that Thursday. He stayed for 2 hours, shook the doctor's hand, and said, "Thank God for modern medicine." Then he flew back to his life. I took family leave. I moved back into my childhood bedroom to help with Dad's recovery. I drove him to appointments, managed his medications, coordinated with his care team. I fought with insurance companies who wanted to discharge him early, who denied coverage for therapies he needed. I spent my savings on things insurance wouldn't cover. Better physical therapy, a nutritionist, home modifications to make the house safer. I didn't think twice about it. They were my parents. This was what you did. Mom got overwhelmed with the logistics. She'd forget appointment times, mix up medications, panic when Dad had bad days. I became the coordinator, the translator, the person who made sure nothing fell through the cracks. I was good at it. I was good at being needed. Then Mom got the diagnosis. Breast cancer, stage 2. Treatable, but the timing. Dad was still recovering. Mom was facing surgery, chemotherapy, radiation. David was busy. Important meetings, client deadlines, kids' activities. I restructured my entire life. I negotiated a remote work arrangement, took on freelance consulting projects to maintain income. I researched oncologists, coordinated treatment schedules, managed 2 sets of medical appointments, 2 insurance policies, 2 recovery timelines. I drove them to appointments at 6 a.m. I sat through chemotherapy sessions, holding Mom's hand while she dozed in the infusion chair. I cleaned house, cooked meals, managed medications. I slept on their living room couch for 4 months. I spent $47,000 of my own money. My savings, my emergency fund, my down payment for the house I'd been dreaming about. It never occurred to me to ask David to contribute. He had a family, a mortgage, responsibilities. I was single, flexible, available. This was my role. When Mom finished treatment, when Dad's cardiac function stabilized, when they were both home and safe and healing, I thought we'd turned a corner. I thought I'd proven something. The phone call came on a Tuesday, same as Dad's heart attack. Mom's voice was different again, not thin this time, but careful, measured. "We need to talk," she said, "about arrangements." I drove over that evening, expecting to discuss their ongoing care, maybe plan for future contingencies. They were getting older. It made sense to have conversations about what they'd want if their health declined again. They sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd done homework, where we'd eaten Sunday dinners, where I'd filled out their insurance forms and organized their pill containers. "We've been thinking," Dad said, "about what happens if something happens to us." "We want to make sure everything is organized," Mom added. They had papers, legal documents, power of attorney forms, medical directives, their wills. David's name was on everything. "We know you've done so much," Mom said quickly. "But David has more experience with financial matters, legal things. We thought it would be easier." Easier. That word again. "He's more stable," Dad said. "More objective. You get so emotionally involved, sweetheart. We don't want to burden you with that kind of responsibility." I stared at the papers. My brother's name typed in neat legal font. His address, his phone number, his authority to make decisions about their lives, their health, their deaths. "I don't understand," I said. "I've been handling everything. I know their doctors, their insurance, their preferences. I've been here." "And we appreciate that," Mom said. "But this is different. This is important. Important. As if the last year hadn't been important. As if the appointments and medications and insurance battles and sleepless nights hadn't been important. As if the $47,000 I'd spent hadn't been important." "We've already talked to David," Dad said. "He's agreed to take on these responsibilities." Of course he had. He'd agreed to sign papers, to be the name on documents, to be the one they called responsible. He'd agreed to the title without the work, the authority without the sacrifice. I signed the papers. I don't know why. Maybe because I was too stunned to refuse. Maybe because I still thought this was about what was best for them. Maybe because I'd spent so long being the emotional one that I'd forgotten I was allowed to be angry. I drove home in a daze. I sat in my empty apartment, the one I'd barely lived in for months, and tried to understand what had just happened. 2 weeks later, I went to lunch with my Aunt Sarah, Mom's sister, the family gossip, but also the family truth teller. "Your mother's been worried about you," she said over soup and sandwiches. "Worried about me?" "She says you've been intense lately, erratic. All that medical stuff really got to you." I set down my spoon. Erratic? She's concerned about your emotional state. All that stress, all those decisions. She thinks it might have been too much for you. The words hit like a physical blow. They'd been talking about me, analyzing my behavior, deciding that my dedication was actually instability, that my competence was actually emotional fragility. "She said David's much better equipped to handle serious family matters," Sarah continued, more level-headed. "You know how you get when you're upset." I did know. I knew exactly how I got when I was upset. I got effective. I got results. I got things done. But that wasn't the story they were telling. I excused myself from lunch. I drove to the hospital where I'd spent countless hours advocating for my parents' care. I sat in the parking lot and cried. Not the pretty, contained tears of the emotional daughter, but the raw, furious tears of someone who'd been betrayed by the people she'd saved. That night, I made a decision. I was done being the emotional one. I was done being the one who cared too much, who sacrificed too much, who made herself smaller to fit their definition of stable. I applied for a fellowship in healthcare policy, a competitive program that would take me across the country to a university that specialized in health systems reform. I'd been accepted 2 years earlier but hadn't gone because Dad was having chest pains and Mom was worried about being alone. This time, I went. The fellowship was intense. 12 months of research, policy analysis, and program development. I studied healthcare financing, insurance regulation, patient advocacy frameworks. I wrote papers about caregiver burnout, about families who went bankrupt paying for medical care, about the gaps in systems that forced people to choose between their health and their financial stability. I was good at it. Not emotionally good, academically, professionally, measurably good. My research advisor, Dr. Martinez, was impressed. "You have an unusual combination of technical knowledge and practical experience, Light," she said. "Most people study these issues from a distance. You've lived them." I had. I'd lived the insurance denials, the medical bills, the impossible choices. I'd lived the exhaustion of being the only one who cared enough to fight. I'd lived the betrayal of being called unstable for refusing to give up. During the fellowship, I developed a pilot program for caregiver support services. Financial counseling, insurance navigation, emotional support groups, resources for people like me. The ones who showed up, who fought, who emptied their savings and their souls to keep their families alive. The program got noticed by hospital administrators, by insurance companies, by policymakers. Not because it was emotional, but because it was effective. It reduced hospital readmissions, improved patient satisfaction, decreased family bankruptcy rates. I was offered a position at a healthcare consulting firm. Not as a patient advocate, as a senior consultant. Someone who advised hospitals and insurance companies on how to better serve families in crisis. I took the job. I moved to San Francisco. I bought a condo with a view of the bay. I built a life that didn't revolve around other people's emergencies. I was good at my work. I was good at being objective, analytical, strategic. I was good at being the person who solved problems instead of the person who cried about them. 2 years into the job, I was promoted to director. I managed a team of consultants, developed programs for major health systems, spoke at conferences about caregiver support and family engagement. I was successful. Measurably, objectively successful. My parents called occasionally. Proud phone calls about my career, my achievements, my apartment, as if they'd always known I'd do well, as if they'd always believed in my potential. David's name was still on their legal documents. He was still the responsible one, the one they trusted with important decisions. But he was also the one who forgot their anniversaries, who missed family gatherings, who called once a month and considered it sufficient. I was the one who sent flowers on Mother's Day, who remembered Dad's dietary restrictions, who knew the names of their doctors. But I was also the one who lived 3,000 miles away, who'd chosen career over family, who'd proven their point about my emotional instability by leaving. That's what they told people anyway. That's what Sarah reported back to me during our occasional phone calls. They miss you, she'd say. But they understand you needed to focus on your career. As if I'd left for selfish reasons, as if I'd abandoned them instead of being abandoned by them. 3 years later, I started my own consulting firm, specialized in healthcare equity, family support systems, caregiver advocacy. I worked with hospitals to develop programs that actually helped families navigate medical crises. I worked with insurance companies to create policies that didn't punish people for caring. I was good at it. More than good, I was transformative. My programs reduced family stress, improved patient outcomes, saved money for health systems. I was invited to speak at national conferences, to advise on federal policy, to consult with international health organizations. I was successful in ways that couldn't be dismissed as emotional instability. I hired a team of consultants, smart, dedicated people who understood that healthcare wasn't just about medical procedures. It was about families, about people who showed up in crisis, about the systems that either supported or betrayed them. One of my consultants, Maria, reminded me of myself at 28. Passionate, dedicated, willing to work 18-hour days to solve problems that mattered. She'd left her job as a hospital social worker to join my firm. I was tired of being the only one who cared, she told me during her interview. I want to build systems that care so individuals don't have to carry everything alone. I hired her immediately. We grew. 5 consultants, then 10, then 20. We worked with major health systems across the country, developed programs that became industry standards, created resources that helped thousands of families navigate medical crises without destroying their financial stability or their emotional well-being. I was proud of what we'd built. Not just successful, proud. We were helping people like me, people who'd been called too emotional for caring too much, people who'd been abandoned by the systems and families they'd sacrificed to save. The phone call came on a Thursday. My assistant, Jennifer, knocked on my office door with an expression I'd learned to recognize. "Your mother's on line 2, she said, and she says it's urgent." I picked up the phone with familiar dread. Mom's voice was thin again, stretched like it might break. "It's David," she said. He's lost his job." I waited. There was more. "The company downsized. He's been looking for months, but the market is tough. He's got the mortgage, the kids' schools." I understood. David needed help, financial help. The kind of help I'd once provided without question. "I was wondering," Mom continued, "if you knew anyone who might be hiring. Someone in your field, maybe. David's interested in consulting work." I did know someone. I knew exactly who was hiring senior consultants in healthcare strategy. Me. "I'll see what I can do," I said. I hung up the phone and sat quietly for a long moment. Then I called my head of HR. "I need you to set up an interview," I said, "for a senior consultant position. Someone's going to apply, and I want to make sure he gets a fair evaluation." 2 weeks later, David applied for the position. His resume was impressive. 10 years in business consulting, experience with healthcare clients, strong analytical skills. On paper, he was qualified. His application went through our standard process: phone screening with HR, technical interview with my senior team, case study presentation, references. He passed every stage. He was professional, competent, articulate. He demonstrated the kind of objective analysis we valued, the kind of strategic thinking we needed. He made it to the final round. The interview with me. I didn't tell him I was the decision maker. I didn't mention that I was the founder of the company, the director of the program, the person who would determine his professional future. I let him walk into my office believing he was meeting with another consultant, Another interviewer, another hurdle to clear. He was surprised to see me, confused, then pleased, then confident. Jasmine, he said, I didn't know you worked here. This is great. Maybe you can put in a good word for me. I smiled. I offered him coffee. I asked about his family, his kids, his job search. I was polite, professional, interested. Then I began the interview. I asked about his experience with healthcare systems, his understanding of patient advocacy, his approach to family engagement during medical crises. His answers were textbook, theoretical, academically sound, but practically empty. Can you give me an example, as I asked, of a time when you had to navigate a complex healthcare situation? Maybe with a family member or close friend? He thought for a moment. Well, when my dad had his heart surgery, I made sure the family was coordinated. I took charge of the legal aspects, made sure we had proper documentation, that kind of thing. What about the day-to-day care, the appointments, the insurance, the recovery process? Oh, that was mostly handled by other family members. I focused on the big picture, the strategic decisions. I nodded. I made notes. I asked follow-up questions about his strategic decision-making, his leadership style, his ability to work with emotionally difficult situations. How do you handle working with clients who are intense? I asked. People who are very emotionally invested in outcomes? I try to keep things objective, he said. Emotional decisions are usually bad decisions. I help people focus on what's practical, what's realistic. And if someone disagrees with your assessment, if they think you're missing something important, he laughed. Then I explained why they're wrong. Usually emotional people just need someone to help them see clearly. I finished the interview. I thanked him for his time. I told him we'd be in touch. After he left, I sat in my office and reviewed his file. His qualifications, his references, his interview notes. He was competent, experienced, professional. He was also exactly the kind of person my company existed to counteract. The kind of person who dismissed emotional investment as instability, who confused caring with incompetence, who believed that strategic thinking meant ignoring the human cost of decisions. I called David that afternoon. I'm sorry, I said. We've decided to go with another candidate. Another candidate? But I thought, I'm your brother. I figured. We selected someone with more direct experience in family healthcare advocacy, I said. Someone who understands the emotional complexity of medical decision-making. There was a long pause. I don't understand, he said finally. I have 10 years of consulting experience. I'm good at this. You're good at strategy, I said, but we need someone who's good at caring. I hung up the phone. I sat quietly for a moment, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not satisfaction, not victory, not revenge. Peace. Because I'd finally understood something that had taken me decades to learn. They didn't need someone calm to handle their medical crisis. They needed someone who cared enough to stay awake at night worrying about insurance denials. They needed someone who cared enough to spend their savings on better care. They needed someone who cared enough to fight when everyone else said there was nothing left to fight for. They needed someone emotional. They needed me. But they chose someone reliable instead. Someone who would sign papers and make strategic decisions and keep his feelings contained. Someone who would prioritize practicality over people. Who would choose efficiency over empathy. They chose stability over love. And now David was learning what I'd learned years ago. That being chosen on paper doesn't mean being chosen in practice. That having authority doesn't mean having competence. That being reliable doesn't mean being reliable when it matters. I'd built a company that helped people like me. People who cared too much, who gave too much, who were dismissed as emotional when they were actually essential. I'd built a life that didn't require their approval, their recognition, their gratitude. I'd built a future that didn't depend on their definition of stability. The phone rang again that evening, Mom's voice careful and measured. David told me about the interview, and she said, I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe you could reconsider? There's no misunderstanding, I said. We hired the best candidate for the position. But he's family. He's your brother. He's been through so much. He's also the person you trusted to make important decisions, and I said. So I'm sure he'll make the right decision about his career. Silence. I don't understand why you're being so, she started. So what? I asked. Emotional? Erratic? Unstable? More silence. I'm being professional, I said. I'm being objective. I'm being exactly what you said I couldn't be. I hung up the phone. I poured myself a glass of wine. I sat on my balcony, looking out at the bay, thinking about the life I'd built. I thought about the families I'd helped, the programs I'd created, the people I'd hired who understood that caring wasn't weakness. I thought about Maria, who'd left her job because she was tired of being the only one who cared. I thought about all the people like us who'd been called too emotional for refusing to give up. I thought about my parents who'd called me unstable for caring too much, who'd trusted their important decisions to someone who cared too little. I thought about David, who'd been chosen for his objectivity, his reliability, his ability to make strategic decisions without getting emotionally involved. I thought about the interview, about his answers, about his confidence that emotional people just needed someone to help them see clearly. I thought about the day I'd sat in that lawyer's office, staring at papers that erased me from their lives. The day I'd learned that love wasn't enough, that sacrifice wasn't enough, that being needed wasn't the same as being valued. I thought about all of it. And I smiled. Because they'd been right about one thing. I was emotional. I cared too much. I got too invested in outcomes. And that's exactly what made me good at my job. That's exactly what made me successful. That's exactly what made me the kind of person who built companies that helped other people like me. They didn't need someone calm to handle their crisis. They needed someone who cared, and I did. But caring doesn't mean accepting. Caring doesn't mean sacrificing. Caring doesn't mean making yourself smaller so other people can feel bigger. Sometimes caring means walking away. Sometimes caring means building something better. Sometimes caring means letting people live with the consequences of choosing reliability over love. I finished my wine. I went inside. I went to bed. And I slept better than I had in years.